Hey HTDA, and today Shapez 2 is coming into early access. Now the developers were kind enough to provide me with a review copy of this game a few weeks ahead of time, which allowed me to do a full run completing all of the main objectives and side objectives. In other words, despite this going live on the release date, I have already played through the entire game. So let's start with the basics. You will be building a factory in this game with one very simple goal: construct specific shapes consisting of layers of smaller shapes, and you deliver those shapes to the central vortex. Deliver enough of these and you will get your next assignment. Now, just because it's easy to explain what you should be doing, that doesn't mean that there's no challenge in this game. A final shape consists out of at least one layer of at most 4 basic forms. You can cut, rotate and recombine these basic shapes to get the end product that you need to deliver to the vortex. There are 4 basic forms, which means that even on a single layer with these basics, you can already form a couple of hundred different final shapes. Early in the game, you also unlock the option to stack these layers, which exponentially multiplies the options you have to make a final shape. Now, add to that to the fact that you can also start painting these shapes and unlock a couple of more basic items like pins and crystals you can add to them, and you have literally millions of possible shapes you can potentially make. Actually, making these shapes, however, is not trivial. You get randomized basics, and especially once you start coloring and layering these things, you really need to figure out how to actually process your base materials in such a way that you actually end up with the target end product that you need. Now, you don't have to worry about things like rotation and stuff like that. If the shape has the right parts and constructed in the right type of way, that counts, even if it might be, for example, rotated to the left or right. As long as you could, in theory, rotate it back to the original facing that the game is showing you, it will count towards the end. However, it does mean that everything needs to be perfectly aligned with each other, have the correct colors, and for example, painting your shape into different colors only works on a per layer basis. So if you have different colors on the same layer, you first need to paint the individual parts and then recombine them and stack them appropriately in order to get the final result that you need. In order to help you understand these more complex shapes made out of several layers, the game has a great feature called the Shape Viewer. This actually allows you to visually break down an item that clearly shows you what parts it is made of. Doesn't actually tell you how to make these parts though, so that is up to you to figure out. So how do you actually make your shapes? Well, you're going to have to build a factory to do that. And unlike in most games in this particular genre, building your factory is actually completely free, which means you can keep rebuilding and expanding as much as you want. Well, sort of. The core buildings and belts and stuff like that are completely free, so you can design and redesign those as much as you want. However, the scale at which you are building will ramp up quite quickly throughout the game, and this is where blueprints come into play. Once you figure out a nice layout to perform a certain task, like for example splitting one belt of items into several belts worth of individual pieces, you can save that layout in a blueprint to be used later. Using those blueprints actually does cost you something. You will need to spend blueprint points. You get these blueprint points by, you guessed it, delivering shapes. Not just any shapes though, but specific types that get more and more blueprint points as a reward as the shapes themselves get more complex. Setting up a steady supply line of these particular shapes therefore is a vital part of the game if you actually want to quickly expand your factory in the long run. One feature about building your factory in this particular game that I really enjoy is the fact that it actually predicts what items are going to flow down a belt way before any item actually reaches that particular end of the belt. So that means that if you add a couple of buildings to your mix, you can already see at the end of the line what item is actually going to roll off the belt at that point. All of this becomes even more important once you reach the mid-game, because at that point you won't just be building cute small little factories on your starting island, but you will be able to expand that factory into a massive universe connecting different platforms by means of space, highways, and later on even giant trains to cover long distances. This means that pretty soon you will want to start designing entire platforms dedicated to a specific purpose that you can then start replicating. And since space on a platform is limited, this provides some really fun additional challenges to come up with the most space efficient platform designs. Once you have a couple of interesting platform designs that are kind of modular in their layout, you can then start combining these platform designs again to make even larger blueprints combining several platforms that allow you to place down thousands of buildings at the same time. So you're going to actually need those blueprint points. That also means you're going to be building a galactic factory consisting out of sets of different platforms, in which each platform again consists out of potentially hundreds of buildings. At this point, you're basically playing a factory game in a factory game once you start zooming in and out. In the meanwhile, the game also challenges you to actually be efficient with your designs, because there is a limit to how many platforms you can place down. You can increase this limit by completing tasks and milestones, so in the long run this isn't really an issue, and I also didn't find it too constraining, but it does help to actually put some challenge in the game, where otherwise you can just freely build whatever you want. All of this is done in a very well-paced scaling up process throughout the entire game. The first scenario acts as a kind of tutorial, but it doesn't really feel like you're playing a tutorial. You're just playing the actual game and unlock more options as you go. Now, these options consist out of new buildings that allow you to cut, slice, paint and recombine your items in different ways, and improvements to those buildings, but later on actually include things like logic signals that allow you to automate your factory even further. The structure of the game is set up in such a way that each new system is introduced by means of a milestone. The next few assignments after unlocking a milestone require you to use whatever you just unlocked, which is a nice way to teach you how to play the game while actually, just playing the game. If you need a little bit more explanation on how things work though, there is a help functionality which is probably one of the best I've ever seen in a game like this. Not only does it actually cover everything I wanted to know about a new mechanic, it does so in a short, to the point way and with visuals to help you illustrate the point. After the first scenario, which should take you a couple of hours, you have unlocked all the basic functionalities, and the game will ask you which scenario you want to play next. The main difference between these different scenarios is just the complexity of the shapes you will be required to make, but this does offer a certain amount of replayability for those that like the intellectual challenge. These scenarios are the core of the game. It is worth noting that your entire progress, including your factory, carries over from the tutorial level or the basic scenario to the core game scenario that you end up picking, so your efforts do not go to waste and doesn't feel like you just played the tutorial but didn't actually make any progress. During the core part of the game, completing milestones doesn't just unlock new things, but you can actually continue to deliver the final shape of each milestone or additional operator levels. These levels provide you with additional rewards, like science and the ability to build more platforms, as well as a worldwide ranking. Now, if you have a competitive streak, like I do, the ranking is a nice touch and another reason to keep playing, but just the level rewards themselves are very much worth the effort. Aside from the milestone assignments, which are basically kind of like the main quest of the game, you can also unlock smaller optional tasks that require you to build even more different shapes. These are a series of increasingly complex shapes that once again will help you to understand how to actually build more complex items and also provide you with additional rewards. And again, that's just going to be platform numbers and science. Now, these additional tasks help to ensure that you always have something to do while you're waiting for your main milestone assignments to be delivered. Near the end of the game, the starting platform that you were initially starting out on and just delivering a couple of simple circles and squares will have transformed into a massive transportation hub that is taking in thousands of items per minute in a swirling tornado of colors. This is my version of that, and I do have to say it is extremely satisfying to see this end product of your hard work. In the very latest stages of the game, you can actually also alternatively start dumping entire trains worth of items directly in the vortex instead, which not only is quite efficient, it is also satisfying to look at in its own right. I do have to say though, I kinda prefer the swirling vortex of items instead. For the really dedicated people, there is actually an endgame item called a signal reader that you can unlock, and that is going to read a randomized endgame goal for you to produce. So the ultimate dream is combining that signal reader with your logic options to build a factory that is completely self-sufficient. Now, I have to admit, I spent quite a few hours on this project already, and I got a pretty decent setup going, but this is also where the early access part of this release comes into play. Because although you can come a long way to optimizing and automating your entire factory, with honestly quite a bit of work involved in that, which honestly is a lot of fun as well, a major part is there still missing, and that is the ability to automate paint flows. So you cannot actually escape some manual work even if you automate everything else. Now it's worth noting that this exact functionality, as in the ability to control your paint flows in an automated way, have already been confirmed by the developer to be coming soon though. So since I am actually playing a version before the actual release, by the time you're watching this might already have been added to the game. All in all, the game offers quite a bit of replayability. I already mentioned the endgame mode and different difficulty settings, but if you want to go really crazy, you can also just set up a custom game in which you impose either more or less constraints on the amount of platforms you can build, resources you have access to, etc, etc. However, this review would not be complete without mentioning the bad stuff. Although there are obviously a few things still missing, the game already does feel very complete, and considering I got about 35 hours out of my first playthrough, with a lot of potential challenges to go, the state of the game is definitely worth the money if what you're seeing so far is interesting to you. That said, I do have a few minor things to note. First of all, I am not a fan of the music in this game. I actually turned it off after a couple of hours as it was starting to drive me crazy. There is a couple of hours worth of music in the game, but it all sounded very much the same to me. I also think it's a little bit of a strange decision to make some of that music actually only available if you either own the first version of the game or if you upgrade to the supporters edition instead. Not game breaking or something you can solve by putting on your own music, but still worth mentioning. And also, don't forget, of course, music taste is super subjective, so take it for what it is. Another thing to note is that when you get right down to it, the game premise is just combining shapes in different ways over and over again. Now you can definitely argue that that isn't much different from other factory games in which you basically combine different raw resources over and over again to make increasingly complex end productions, but in this case I can imagine it will feel maybe a bit more repetitive to some players than it would in those other games. There are a couple of quality of life things I would like to see added in the future as well. For example, you can make tunnels and bridges for your space belts, but right now you need to do that manually every single time. This does get a bit tedious after a while, especially since most of the belt connecting in the rest of the game is extremely smart and intuitive. So this in particular kind of stands out. Maybe there could be an option where you hold down a certain button where it actually doesn't snap to anything else, but it will automatically make tunnels and bridges and things like that to avoid colliding with anything in particular. All of that said, at this point I am pretty much nitpicking as I can't really come up with any significantly bad things to say about this game. Although the game will likely not appeal to everyone, at least what it sets out to do it does extremely well. The visuals are great, the building is extremely smooth with a couple of rare exceptions, and I was able to build a giant factory without any FPS issues whatsoever, and, last but not least, I didn't experience a single crash in dozens of hours of gameplay. Although this game is a little less complex than some of the other factory building games out there, it is still quite challenging and engaging. And because it is so approachable and comes with a great tutorial, this might very well be a gateway game for new players to be sucked into the factory building genre. I could even imagine younger kids playing this game because the visual aspects make it pretty easy to understand what is going on, and it doesn't really require you to stare at recipe lists or ratios or anything like that for hours and hours to figure out how much of what item you need to make whatever you want to start making. You can just look at it and it is super intuitive what you're supposed to do next. Now, just to throw it out there once again, the game is just releasing into early access as this video is recorded, and compared to some of the other early access games I've played before, this one is actually very complete. It kind of feels like a finished game already in its current state. Now, don't let the early access state therefore scare you off either, because some of the most popular factory building games in the genre, like Satisfactory and Dyson Sphere Program, are also currently still in early access and have already sold millions of copies and have been fan favorites for years. Long story short, this game definitely gets my recommendation if it seems like the type of thing you would be interested in. Go ahead and get it. I don't think you are going to regret it in any way, shape or form. If you like this type of game and you would like to see more reviews along with guides and let's plays and things like that, make sure you subscribe to the channel and consider becoming a member if you want to support me as well. Members get early access to my content as well as inclusion in the credits. Either way, if you're still here, you are awesome, and I hope to catch you in the next one.